my friends. Welcome to me, your host, Christian Watson. So, my friends, the intelligentsia, particularly the academic elite intelligentsia of a few top major schools that are renowned in the world for their educational affinity, or rather, for their position in an athletic league, have released a statement and are now bellowing out in horror at the impending death of American democracy, or the supposed impending death of American democracy. As this article here from Forbes.com says, more than 100 scholars issue warning that American democracy is in danger, calls for federal reforms. I shall read a bit of their sentiments and dissect the specimens of their sentiments and then explain a little bit of why this is happening and how I think is a good way to look at this kind of stuff. Because right now, many individuals are automatically defaulting to the states' rights defense, to the federalism defense. States' rights being that states should be able to govern themselves without federal interference, and federalism being that federal government should have a certain set of powers, and the states should also have a certain set of powers, and those powers should be separate, distinct, and equal, or whatever. And those two defenses are a little bit too narrow for our purposes right now. We want to actually understand the depths of this stuff. So, the statement, which is signed by more than 100 scholars, warns that as a result of Republican-led states proposing or implementing radical changes to election laws, the voting procedures in several states are being transformed into political systems that no longer meet the minimum conditions for free and fair elections. These very nebulous phrases that just state things and don't really establish the foundation of an argument. The statement includes this dire prediction: our entire democracy is now at risk. Appearing on the website of Washington, D.C.-based think tank New America, the statement entitled Statement of Concern, the Threats to American Democracy and the Need for National Voting and Election Administration Standards. These people call themselves scholars of democracy. And they believe, as happened in several states, that the voting laws in places like Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Iowa, Montana, and Texas are fundamentally a threat to American democracy. So, let's first address first principles here, because I think that a lot of people, including the intelligentsia, takes the word democracy and America right next to it for granted. So let's address first principles here, my friends. These scholars are using a lot of words that in all reality, as I mentioned before, trade emotional sustenance for a lack of substance. But emotions and how things make us feel have no inherent bearing on the substance of an argument. When you say that something is a threat to a free and fair election, you can get away with not defining what a free or fair election is, or not considering if elections can even possibly be fair given be free given their nature. You can get away with that because guess what? The emotional response and the sort of already accepted premises of a free and fair election allow you to get away with more than you would if you were able to actually define that. When you say a threat to democracy, you are presuming that America's first principles are predicated upon democracy and our governmental structures follow, which allows you to get away without actually defining and defending the proposition that America is a democracy. In all reality, my friends, those two phrases, free and fair elections and a threat to democracy, are rhetorically loaded value statements which do not correspond to the material reality of the American experiment. What is that material reality? The American experiment, its structure, i.e. our government, is predicated upon the principle of a republic, upon the principles of a government established for very core functions, and those core functions are then represented in houses of legislatures, houses of Congress, so to speak, and those legislatures in Congress are meant to, throughout the ages, maintain a strong sense of those original principles. And people are able to exercise their own desires to their legislators through the public process by voting and so on and so forth. That is the structure of the American experiment, predicated upon certain eternal axioms and therefore given specific duties. Now, the problem with this free idea, the idea of free elections, it's essentially granting a personal quality to an impersonal process. An election cannot necessarily be free because only human beings can be free. Only human beings have the capacity to be free. Now, when you don't define what freedom actually means, which is simply the lack of interference from an external source upon your natural ability to act, your natural capacity, your will to act, when you don't define what that actually means, you can easily get away with this stuff. But there's no such thing as a free election. Elections are necessarily restricted and regulated since they are nothing more than governmental processes. There's not a single governmental process that is free. Every governmental process is beset by some kind of regulation. And in fact, it's ironic because these scholars are actually themselves recommending federal regulations, which makes elections less free. Now, by free, these scholars mean accessible. They believe that elections are being inaccessible or being made inaccessible by many state legislatures as they pass these roving laws. Now, I'm not going to get into the minutiae of many of these laws. I have addressed the Georgia law at length in a video that I will link in the description. You can watch that. I am more interested in the principles that these sentiments convey and how they weigh against reality, because right now they're not doing very good. And so when you view freedom as accessibility, what does that do? That sets up a comparison, a dichotomy, that views freedom as either, as number one, as being granted and either being accessible or inaccessible. And for there to be accessibility, it has to be allowed. This allows the government to come in as an agent and allows the government itself to become the definition of freedom. Or rather, you being granted something to become the definition of freedom. These scholars, first and foremost, are operating on a wrong definition of freedom. Freedom is not given to you. It is preserved. It is a part of your DNA. It is a part of who you are. If freedom is taken or given to you or from you, then what is the basis for rights? Well, the basis for rights, again, is access, which makes rights wholly useless because they are not imbued with consistency. The reason the idea of natural rights is so wonderful and precious to the American experiment is because they are consistent and not dependent on the dynamic wills of human beings or legislatures. If something is given to you, that is not a right, that is a privilege. In this broader idea of accessibility is primarily why these scholars are also using the term democracy to describe their plight. But of course, the material structure of the American Republic, on both an axiomatic level and a political level, have nothing to do with democracy and everything to do with first principles that are established and preserved and perpetuated and propagated through the government. Democracies, however, have some kind of understanding of first principles, but those first principles are not necessarily stable, and they are subject to the wills, the ravenous wills of the majority. Where the majority goes, the principles also go. This was why Athenian democracy itself was such a chaotic thing, because the majority quite literally ran everything. My friends, America is no democracy. This is a tired point that has been made over and over and over again. But on a level of truth, axioms, America cannot possibly be democracy because its principled conceptual DNA does not cohere with an understanding of democracy. Now, a lot of political scientists like to play with words and terms to manipulate and contort the idea of democracy to be compatible with the essence of the American experiment. But if we're going to actually stick to epistemic truth and definitions, that is not good, and that is not correct. Well, we're a democratic republic. No, we're not. Democracy's demos and kratos, power people, rests primarily on the ability of a majority to actualize their desires through legislative processes. A republic has a buffer between their desires, because that buffer is meant to protect the first principles of the republic. But let's get more into this, because there is a even bigger reason as to why scholars are able to get away with this kind of stuff, and this kind of language is so popular. Because if we view freedom as accessibility, and democracy as the foundation of that access, and as a necessary component of that access, We would then view rights, which are inherently related to freedom in political systems, as also means of accessibility, right? The right to healthcare, right to voting, right? All this stuff, again, are on the basis of you being able to access them, not on the basis of you have already accessing something by the fact that you exist. So the idea of voting rights is at the centerpiece of these criticisms. And I have said this before, I'll say it again. Voting, by any meaningful and substantive definition of the word rights, is not a right. Now, when I say this, you don't think I'm talking about a conceptual issue. You think I'm trying to erase, or some people think I'm trying to erase, the achievements made by so many African Americans during the civil rights era to preserve their ability to vote against the ravenous, wretched wills of the Jim Crow custodians. And this speaks to the level of ahistorical and aphilosophical mediocrity that runs rampant in the American mind. Because when I talk about a concept, that concept is immediately associated with something that many people, most decent people, should indeed be in appraisal of, and therefore, me being against a concept means I'm against that decent thing. So me being against welfare means that I must be against poor people. Me being against taxes means I must want grandma to die. Me being against the idea of voting rights must mean I want us to go back to Jim Crow. This is the association, the sort of cacophony of non sequiturs which drive our political understanding. But my friends, I'm here to tell you something. Concepts stand independent of incidences. Those two can be related. I can have a concept in reality, or I can have a concept in the conceptual realm, and I can evaluate both of those things. Both of them are important, but I'm talking about voting rights in a conceptual way right now. Nothing that can be given to you is a right. That includes voting. Now, voting is most certainly a privilege. It is an important privilege. It is a privilege that should not be unnecessarily restricted. But that's not what these scholars are saying. They're treating voting as a sacrosanct thing. And the idea of voting being a right is the same idea as the government, once again, being a rights-bearing structure. The government, my friends, is simply force. They are a consortium of force backed up by many legislative officiations. That's all the government really is. It is force. Now, force can be used for good, or it can be used for bad. But to say that voting is a right is to suggest that there's some sort of a rights-bearing quality to the ballot box. And of course, this is not a correct understanding of rights as non-interference. It is a correct understanding of a privilege, or a special duty given to you, but it is not the correct understanding of a right. Again, consistency and stability are very important for rights, as these, or at least in the American context, as these are the basis for our government. So, both by principle and by definition, voting cannot be necessarily a right. That does not mean, again, that we need to restrict voting unnecessarily, but it does mean that we need to treat voting very differently, not as this sort of religious sacrament that everyone has to partake in to be a sort of true and valid individual in a democratic context or whatever. But we should treat it as an important tool that should be used to put people into office who will respect first principles and who will not indulge into the ravenous desires of their constituents. That's how voting should be viewed properly, but it's not viewed as that. It is viewed as an indispensable tool for existence, for political existence, because at one point in time, it was a very indispensable tool to fight back against injustice. And guess what? Guess what? Just because there is emotional significance correlated with a particular topic does not mean that topic need be guided by emotions. Let's stop with the emotions. Let's stop with the doomsaying. Let's stop with the fear-mongering, and let's try to do some philosophy here. Let's try to actually understand what these things mean. When we understand what these things mean, and we drop the loaded language, and we live in consistency with the principles of the American experiment, we will have a much more productive conversation. much less fear, and I suspect more efficacious results, since the government that these scholars want to use for their political purposes is itself predicated upon axioms which cannot be so easily rendered away by false notions, macro notions, such as this idea that America is a democracy. Think on it. My friends, I love you. Want to support me? Please. Patreon.com/officialcwatson or officialcwatson@gmail.com. My locals is coming very soon. Don't worry, very soon. I love you guys so much. Please like, share, subscribe, comment, hit the notification bell, please. Most importantly, guys, stay pensive. Bye, guys. Love you.